Foundation Archive. Night Shift. 5 files are cleared for review this session. It knows you. The cure is worse. Never see its face. It never runs. No exit found. Lights low. Playback begins now. The object designated SCP-093 is a disk of red stone composite resembling cinnabar, measuring just over 7 centimeters in diameter. It fits comfortably within a closed palm without abrading the skin. Concentric circular engravings and symbols of unknown origin are carved across its surface to a uniform depth of half a centimeter, with deeper cuts present at intervals between 1 and 1.5 centimeters. When held by a living individual, the disk changes hue. The colors it takes have not yet been correlated with certainty to any single variable, though current Foundation belief holds that the changes depend upon regrets carried by the holder. SCP-093 is to remain on a mirror at all times and under continuous video surveillance. Admittance to its containment area is to be authorized only with proper recording and subject retrieval procedures already in place. Any attempt to use the object outside of an approved test will be dealt with severely, up to and including termination of the responsible personnel. If the object is removed from a mirror and not held by a person, it will seek out the nearest mirror-like surface. Observation indicates that the disk rolls in the largest possible circle available to it, accelerating to phenomenal speed by a mechanism that is currently unknown. Should any obstacle stand between the disk and the nearest reflective surface, it will use this accumulated momentum to punch through that obstacle and continue on its course at velocity. It stops only when contact with a mirror-like surface is achieved. Despite tremendous impact velocities recorded during testing, no damage is dealt to the disk itself, nor to the mirror it ultimately strikes. The records that would clarify the nature of the object's discovery or its presence within the Foundation do not exist. The recovered original documentation that follows constitutes the only known prior account of its behavior, and the test series that succeeds it represents the entirety of current operational knowledge. The original recovered file places the object on the shore of the Red Sea on the 30th of January, 1968. At the time of recovery, it was described as emitting a low sigh and a dim blue gleam. Its color has since shifted, settling into an orange-tinged red, and the audible component has reduced to a hum of varying volume, most pronounced in the presence of female examiners between the ages of 34 and 41. The object briefly returned to its documented blue for 54 minutes and 34 seconds at 1:23 in the morning on the 26th of April, 1986. This was coincident with the discovery of the body of one designated personnel within a Foundation research facility. Ties between that death and the object remain inconclusive. Effects of prolonged exposure have been reported by some handlers as periods of unusual calmness, and by others as recurring waves of melancholy, loss of balance, and intrusive thoughts of self-destruction, though such episodes have not exceeded 11 days in duration. The object reacted to the presence of one further subject on the 12th of March, 1993, by turning light violet for no more than 2 minutes and 9 seconds. The effects of this reaction remain unknown. Documents pertaining to the original recovery were destroyed in a fire at a research facility on the 9th of December, 1989. Following the loss of the original procedures, a containment test, designated T1, was initiated to determine why mirrors specifically were required to hold the object inert. The disk was first placed upon a retail-grade mirror set within a brass frame. It rested without activity. This single observation removed any need for costly silver-lined or wooden containment systems. When set instead upon a standard wooden table, the disc turned upright and began to roll across the surface in one direction, completing a U-turn at the edge, then traversing back, tracing an oval path that it repeated without pause. A mirror brought into the vicinity drew it immediately. The object rolled toward the mirror and laid itself flat against the glass, sliding to the center. Despite the grainy texture of the stone, no mark was left upon the mirror's surface. With two mirrors placed at opposite ends of the table, the disc gravitated to the nearer of the two, showing no preference for type or quality, only for proximity. When a mirror was held by a person and moved about the room, the disc followed at increasing speed, reaching a maximum velocity that has since been redacted. At no recorded velocity did its impact damage either object. The final observation of the containment test was accidental, arising from a brief altercation between staff regarding the settlement of a lunch tab. One researcher, holding the disc, was tripped by another and fell against a mirror mounted nearby. The disc was driven against the reflective surface while still in his grasp. As a result of this unintended demonstration, it was established that a living person holding SCP-093 and placing it against a mirror will in fact pass through the mirror. Containment testing was discontinued at this point, the requirement of a mirror for rest having been confirmed. Authorization was granted for a second series of tests, designated T2, to investigate the destinations reached through such passage. Subjects were to wear a Class 3 buckle harness anchored to a tension pulley system permitting roughly 300 meters of movement, with spools available to extend that distance if required. Each subject was issued a light source, water, rations, a firearm to be handed across only after entry, and a field knife concealed within the kit, which the subject was expected to discover unaided. A wired camera was mounted on the shoulder or head, wireless feeds having shown unreliable behavior in untested color states. The color of the disc was to be recorded at each test, alongside the documented history of the subject, in order to assess the link between the object's hue and the guilt carried by the holder. The first documented passage is the blue test. The subject was a male of 34 years and strong build, with a history of violence on record. The subject was cooperative throughout preparation. He held the disc, which emitted a blue color, and stepped into the provided mirror. Technicians stationed outside the frame observed that the mirror retained a true reflection of the room until the subject had passed entirely through, at which point the surface shifted to display an outdoor landscape heavily tinged in blue. The camera flickered to life and showed lowland plains stretching in every direction, ordinary grass and weeds bending in a soft breeze, every shade of the scene overlaid with the same persistent blue. No trees were visible. No living thing moved within the frame. The subject panned the camera in a slow arc and reported no landmarks. He then proceeded forward as instructed. After approximately 500 steps, a patch of barren ground became visible ahead. As he approached, the grass at the edge of this patch could be seen to be dying. 300 further steps brought him to the lip of a hole dug into the earth using tools whose origin could not be determined. The pulley system was engaged, and the camera registered a faint shudder. The subject was instructed to descend. After mild protest, he complied. No ladder or rope was present within the hole. He relied entirely on his own grip and on the tension of the cable to slow his descent. Approximately 100 meters of cable were paid out before he reached the bottom. The light source from the field kit was activated 50 meters down as exterior light grew unreliable. Sweeping the beam revealed only bare dirt, even at the floor of the shaft. The subject moved forward. When asked about the blue tinge of the landscape above, he expressed confusion, stating that from his perspective there had been no such tinge and never was. Light became visible further down the passage. 150 meters of cable had been used. Off camera, the sound of the firearm being readied was recorded. When questioned, the subject described the action as justified precaution and continued onward. The walls of the tunnel changed from bare earth to a poured concrete enclosure. The subject reported a stench. The distant light proved to be a row of ceiling fixtures, of which less than a quarter were broken while the rest still functioned. 6 doors lined the corridor, 3 to each side, with a 7th door at the far end half blocked by what appeared to be the rusted remains of generic metal shelving of the type used in retail stores. This debris suggested prior human presence. The subject was requested to try the doors in whatever order he chose. The first on the right was locked. The second, unlocked, would not move, blocked from the far side. The third matched the first. Crossing the corridor, he found that the third door on the opposite side opened freely, and light from within was bright enough that he switched off his lamp. The room beyond was bare. The walls, however, were heavily soiled. The subject stated that the material on them was not dirt. He could not identify it. It resembled melted plastic, brown rather than black in color. He closed the door. The second door on the left side had no handle. The opening where one had been was plugged with unknown material. The frames of all the doors were fitted in such a way that nothing could be seen through them at any angle, even at the ground. The first door on the left was locked, but a fragment of the key remained jammed in the lock, broken off at the bow. With some effort, the subject manipulated the broken key and forced the door open. He immediately began to cough, again citing the stench. Within, the walls and floor were clean, but the ceiling was coated in the same strange brown residue as the earlier room. A makeshift cot of aged blankets and a pillow occupied one corner. A wooden crate held boxes of what had once been food, the writing on which appeared as illegible squiggles on the recorded feed, though the subject stated plainly that they read simply cereal. A second crate contained empty, dried-out water bottles. A closed book lay beside the cot, bearing no title or mark. Articles had been clipped to the walls, but the language upon them could not be read. The subject was asked to remove them. All but one crumbled to fragments at his touch. The intact piece was sealed in a sample container. He was then asked to investigate the book. As he moved toward it, the audio of the feed broke into a high-pitched screech like grinding metal that dominated all communication for 3.5 seconds. The subject had not yet touched the book. When the noise ceased, he asked Control to repeat their last instruction. Control had issued none. Their headsets had been removed against the noise. The subject was advised to leave the room. He noted that the door had begun, of its own accord, to swing slowly shut. He was told to leave it as it was and to investigate the second door on the right. Careful review of the next 10 seconds of recording reveals, as the camera pans, a figure at the far end of the corridor where the 7th blocked door stands. The door is open just wide enough for a face to be visible through the crack. No details can be discerned. It closes again in silence. The subject, unaware, pushed at the second door on the right. After repeated impacts, it gave enough to admit a partial view. A board hung within, more clippings affixed to it. The top of one of the cereal boxes lay on the floor. A hand was also visible, palm upturned, its owner out of frame. The subject closed the door, passed the sealed 7th door without incident, and, finding nowhere further to explore, was recalled. He offered no protest, complaining only of the worsening stench. As he began the return ascent, Control reported a sudden surge of cable, an additional 100 meters drawn through the pulley before the line went briefly slack and then snapped tight again. The subject denied climbing, stating that he was being drawn upward. He was instructed to ready the firearm. Upon emerging at the surface, he reported no change to the landscape. He began to follow the cable back toward the mirror. After approximately 900 steps, he asked how much line he had used and noted, with growing concern, that the cable now lay along a path that bent through a 90-degree angle, departing from a single point in the open ground. He was asked to pan the camera in a full, slow circle. Behind him, the recording captured 37 countable figures standing in silence upon the plane. Their features could not be identified. They alone, of all things visible, did not carry the blue tinge of the landscape. Panic was noted in the control room. The subject, however, reported only the angled cable. He tugged his end. It remained taut. Control engaged the pulley. Slack reeled in rapidly. Movement of disturbed grass could be followed down the angled portion of the cable until the line met resistance and gave a sharp twang as it recoiled. More slack was then allowed back, before once again being suddenly returned. Control demanded that the subject follow the cable's path back. Screams entered the audio. 5 shots were fired at something not within the camera's frame. Control observed the subject reappear at the point of origin, while the camera showed the cable terminating in a single point, floating in empty air. As he passed through that point, all remaining cable returned to the pulley, and the camera filmed only the floor. The mirror required approximately 5 seconds to resolve back into a true reflection. The disc remained blue for 1 further hour after recovery. A vile-smelling fluid was found on the subject's clothing around his hands when the firearm was retrieved. It dried quickly and was deemed insufficient for study. Control personnel monitoring the mirror reported having seen, in those final seconds, a humanoid form crawling along the ground on the far side, approximately 50 times the size of a person, its face entirely featureless and its arms strikingly short, dragging itself toward the surface before the reflection returned. At least one observer noted that the smooth, featureless face appeared to bear marks consistent with having been shot. The recovered field kit contained a single newspaper clipping, the contents of which have been classified. The next test in the series is designated the green test. Within Research Sector 02 at Site 19, a standard secure humanoid containment cell holds an entity that wears its profession like a second skin. The subject stands roughly 1.9 meters tall and bears the unmistakable silhouette of a medieval plague doctor. Thick robes hang from its shoulders. A long ceramic beaked mask covers its face. Heavy gloves cloak its hands. To the casual observer, the figure appears costumed in the garments of 15th century pestilence physicians. Closer examination reveals that these garments are not worn. They have grown. The robes are continuous with the body beneath, behaving as a thick hide built up over the skin. The mask is not a fitted prosthesis, but a chitinous outgrowth originating from the bones of the face. Imaging confirms that a humanoid skeletal structure exists beneath this layered exterior, though it has long since been subsumed by the encroaching apparel. The entity is designated SCP-049. Its object class is Euclid. It is generally cooperative. It is also, by every available measure, profoundly uncanny. Containment of the entity follows a layered protocol designed around its apparent cooperation and its capacity for sudden, lethal escalation. Before any transport, the subject is sedated. During movement between locations, it is secured within a Class 3 humanoid restriction harness, which includes a locking collar and extension restraints, and it is escorted at all times by no fewer than 2 armed guards. While the subject is generally agreeable in its interactions with Foundation personnel, any outburst or sudden behavioral shift is to be met with elevated force. Under no circumstances are personnel to come into direct physical contact with the entity during such episodes. Direct skin contact is itself the central hazard. In the event the subject becomes aggressive, researchers have documented that the application of lavender, specifically Lavandula multifida, produces a measurable calming effect on the entity. Once calmed, the subject reliably becomes compliant and will return to its containment cell with little or no resistance. The mechanism by which the plant produces this effect is unknown, though it is consistent enough to be considered standard containment practice. To facilitate ongoing study and containment, the subject was historically provided with the corpse of a recently deceased animal, typically a bovine or other large mammal, once every 2 weeks. The entity would operate upon these corpses for extended periods, using implements drawn from a black leather doctor's bag it carries upon its person at all times. The internal volume of this bag appears to exceed its external dimensions. The subject has been observed withdrawing instruments larger than the bag itself from within it. When these surgical procedures resulted in the creation of a reanimated specimen, designated SCP-049-2, such instances were removed from the cell and incinerated. Following a recent incident, the subject is no longer permitted to interact with human subjects, and all requests by the entity for human subjects are denied. A temporary update to containment, issued by Containment Committee Order 049.S19, further restricts the subject from direct interaction with any Foundation staff and prohibits the provision of any additional corpses for use in its surgeries. This order is to persist indefinitely, until such time as a consensus regarding the entity's long-term containment can be reached. The entity is fluent in a variety of languages, though it shows a clear preference for English and a form of medieval French. It is stated that it originated in 15th century France, while also describing itself as particularly well-traveled. In conversation, it is cordial, articulate, and at times disarmingly affable. It refers to its work in the language of a professional physician. It speaks of cures, of patience, of practice, and of progress. Its courtesy, however, is conditional. The subject will become irritated and at times openly aggressive if it feels itself to be in the presence of what it calls the pestilence. The exact nature of this pestilence is unknown to Foundation researchers. The subject has not been able to identify it by any recognized disease. It will not describe its symptoms in any consistent way. It speaks of the pestilence as a singular and universal affliction, an unspeakable horror that has shown its face many times and will again. To the entity, it is the only sickness that exists in the world of men. It is also, by its own account, the entity's lifelong purpose to eradicate it. When the subject identifies an individual as being affected by the pestilence, its behavior shifts. It will become hostile, and if not restrained, will attempt to kill the perceived patient. The method of killing is the entity's defining anomaly. Through direct skin contact, it is capable of causing all biological functions of an organism to cease. The exact mechanism remains undocumented. Autopsies performed on the entity's victims have, in every case, been inconclusive. After such killings, the subject has expressed frustration and, on occasion, remorse, indicating that the death itself has done little to defeat the pestilence. It will then typically proceed to perform a crude surgery upon the corpse, drawing instruments from its black bag. These surgeries are not always successful by the entity's own standards, but they frequently produce reanimated specimens. These specimens are designated SCP-049-2. They are the entity's stated cure. The reanimated specimens retain no recognizable memory or higher mental function. They possess only basic motor skills and rudimentary response mechanisms. In typical observation, they are inactive, shifting little, ambulating slowly when they move at all. They can, however, become extremely aggressive when provoked, or when directed to attack by the entity itself. Biological function within these specimens is active but markedly altered from baseline human physiology. The configurations of their organs and tissues differ from any known anatomy. Limbs may be inverted. Orifices appear where none should exist. Despite these obvious deviations, the entity routinely remarks that its patients have been cured. It speaks of them with the proprietary satisfaction of a physician who has completed difficult work. When pressed on the discrepancy between its description and the observed result, it grows defensive, then agitated. The cure, it insists, is most effective. The subject was discovered during the investigation of a series of unexplained disappearances in the town of Montauban in southern France. During a raid on a local home, investigators encountered several active instances of the -2 specimens, as well as the entity itself. While law enforcement personnel engaged the hostile reanimated forms, the subject was observed standing apart from the violence, watching the engagement, and taking notes in its leather journal. After the -2 instances were dispatched, the entity willingly entered Foundation custody, offering no resistance. An initial interview was conducted by Dr. Raymond Ham of Site 85. The subject opened the exchange in French before switching to English at Dr. Ham's prompting, addressing him as a colleague, a fellow man of medicine. It expressed relief that it had not been abducted by common street thugs. It observed the cleanliness of the interview room and remarked approvingly that there was little trace of the pestilence in such a place. When Dr. Ham asked what it meant by pestilence, the entity referred to it as the scourge, the great dying. It struggled to recall a specific name, tapping the side of its mask in apparent frustration, before insisting that the affliction abounded outside the walls and that many more would succumb until a perfect cure could be developed. Dr. Ham asked whether it was speaking of the bubonic plague. The subject paused. It said that it did not know what that was. The interview continued. Dr. Ham asked whether the entities encountered at the house had been dead when the subject first reached them, and whether it had then reanimated them. The subject demurred at the simplicity of the question. Life and death, it said, sickness and health, these were amateur terms for amateur physicians. There was only one ailment in the world of men, and that was the pestilence. The recovered specimens, it insisted, had been very ill. Dr. Ham observed that the things recovered had not been human. The entity paused, glared, and conceded only that its cure was not yet perfect. Time, it said, and further experimentation would resolve that. It then began to dictate terms, requesting a laboratory of its own and assistance, the latter of which, it noted with a small laugh, it could provide for itself in time. The interviewer recorded a particular note in the margin of the transcript. The subject communicates in a very human manner, and yet a strange sense of unease accompanies any time spent in its presence. Something about it, he wrote, is profoundly uncanny. The pointed wooden stick the entity had been gesturing with throughout the interview was confiscated under standard protocols, in part because it had been waved about with a menacing carelessness. The subject was displeased. Concessions were made. Test subjects, it was suggested, might be provided on a regular schedule for the benefit of ongoing research. Once installed at Site 19, the subject devoted itself to study. It would spend several days operating upon a provided mammalian corpse, then several more days documenting its findings within a thick leather journal kept inside its bag. The journal is written in no known language. Linguists and codebreakers have failed to decipher it. The subject often sought to share its findings with members of staff. In the first formal observation, a test subject from the disposable personnel pool was introduced into the cell. The entity expressed sincere gratitude. It asked the subject several standard medical questions while removing tools from its bag. Then, with sudden speed, it closed the distance and killed the subject with a single touch to the throat. It proceeded to make considerable alterations to the corpse, introducing fluids from within its bag by way of a hand-powered pump and copper tubing. The resulting specimen became animated. It flailed and grasped at the walls with a number of manufactured limbs while moaning out of an oblong orifice now present in its sternum. The entity took notes and remarked to the watching staff about the efficacy of its cure. When security entered to return the entity to containment, the new specimen attacked them. The team dispatched it. The entity returned to its cell without resistance, stating that it was pleased with the results. In a later observation, the corpse of a recently deceased goat was provided. The entity worked for several days and produced a reanimated instance. It described the result as satisfactory, noting that its veterinary practice was rudimentary, but that the patient had responded well. In another, the corpse of an orangutan was provided. The entity expressed particular gratitude due to the similarities between primate and human anatomy. It worked for several days, reanimating the corpse, then returning to it 3 more times for further adjustments. After it was unable to reanimate the body a 5th time, it surrendered the corpse for incineration, lamenting that its early optimism had been misplaced, and stating that more subjects of that kind would do a great deal to advance its research. A more detailed log records a session involving the corpse of a recently deceased bovine. The entity expressed mild annoyance at the provision, having repeatedly requested human subjects, but accepted it. It worked for several days, breaking only to dine on a requested meal of thin crackers, salted pork, and hard cheese. It has stated that it does not require sustenance, but enjoys it, and that food helps to put it in the proper mindset to operate. It began by embalming the corpse. It then produced a number of long syringes from its bag, each containing a different dark and viscous fluid, which it described as essences of the humors. The pestilence, it explained, brings about a systemic imbalance, and before true healing can begin, one must find the humors in balance, lest the body reject the cure. It added, with audible condescension, that this was elementary knowledge for any practical physician. Over several days, it adjusted the organs of the bovine with large metal instruments. On the 8th day, it produced a lightning rod. Dr. Ham exchanged the rod for an electric cattle prod attached to an extension cord, which the entity accepted, and the corpse was struck in several locations. The bovine became ambulatory once again, despite the inversion of its head and the reorientation of its limbs. In the follow-up interview, Dr. Ham pressed the subject on its process. The entity declined to detail its methods, referring him instead to its journals. When Dr. Ham observed that he did not understand what the pestilence was, nor how turning creatures into quasi-living, mindless drones could be considered a cure, the entity grew suddenly agitated. Its cure, it insisted, was a true cure. The creature before them was clean, unable to spread the affliction, free from the terror it would otherwise have suffered. One does not, it said, wait for rotten timbers to bring down the hall before pulling them out. One does not mock the structure simply because it now looks different. The structure is strong. It is free of disease. The attending researcher's note recorded a quiet suspicion. The entity, he wrote, may be more aware of the reality of its outcomes than it would like its observers to think. On the 16th of April 2017, the pattern broke. Dr. Ham entered the test chamber for what was intended to be another routine interview. As he stepped inside, the entity grew anxious. It asked him whether he was feeling well. Following protocol, Dr. Ham reminded the entity that the interview was required. The entity became hostile. It killed him. Due to a lapse in security protocol, and because Dr. Ham did not activate the in-chamber emergency system, his body was not discovered for 3 hours. By the time staff entered the cell, the entity had converted him into an instance of SCP-049-2. In the interview that followed, conducted by Dr. Theron Sherman of Site-42, the entity at first refused to speak. When directed to explain itself, it said only that its actions did not need to be explained. When Dr. Sherman stated plainly that Dr. Ham had been killed and butchered, the entity interrupted, insisting that he was not dead. He was, it said, cured. Pressed on what disease Dr. Ham could possibly have presented with, the entity began to falter. The pestilence, it said, presents and progresses in unforeseeable fashions. It has a queer way of creeping into the unprepared. Its breathing grew heavier as it spoke. It called the killing a mercy. Dr. Sherman replied that the man was a vegetable. The entity grew angry. It accused the doctors of being not men of science but men of emotion, unable to appreciate the horrors it had seen, the many millions who had succumbed and been changed. Dr. Sherman ended the interview, declaring the entity's allowances revoked. As the recording ran out, the entity continued speaking, its words trailing into something quieter. It had saved him, it said. Dr. Ham had been sick. It knew he had been sick. They were all sick, but it could save them. It could cast the plague down, once and for all. Only it could do this. It was the cure. 3 weeks later, in a closing interview conducted by Dr. Elijah Itkin, the entity was asked whether it felt any remorse for what it had done. It waved a gloved hand. The death of a colleague, it said, was always regrettable. But in the face of the pestilence, one must be swift and act without hesitation. It noted, with something approaching enthusiasm, that the incident had provided important insight. Living human subjects, it had concluded, were the only way to proceed forward. Its desires now turned towards tending to those still living who suffered from the disease. Dr. Itkin informed it that it would be disappointed. The entity laughed quietly. "Oh, doctor," it said, "I would not be so sure." The leather journal, still kept inside the impossibly deep black bag, continues to be filled. The language remains undeciphered. The entity remains, by all available measures, cooperative. It also remains, beneath the layered hide and the chitinous mask, watchful and patient. Somewhere within a sealed steel cube, a pale humanoid paces the eastern wall in perfect silence. It does not eat, it does not sleep in any recognizable pattern. It is docile, malnourished, and almost pitiful. And yet, Foundation directives forbid any lens, any photograph, any glance at its face. Tonight, we open the file on SCP-096. SCP-096 is classified Euclid. The designation reflects not the entity's ferocity, which is considerable, but the fragility of the conditions required to keep it dormant. Containment is straightforward in construction, yet unforgiving in execution. The subject is held within a cell measuring 5 meters on each side, a perfectly airtight cube of reinforced steel. Weekly inspections are mandatory. Every surface, every seam, every weld is examined for the smallest fracture or aperture. A single crack, a single pinhole is treated as a critical containment failure. Under no circumstances is any form of optical instrument permitted within the cell. No cameras, no lenses, no mirrors, no reflective surface of any kind. Security personnel confirm the subject's presence solely through pressure sensors set into the floor and laser detectors positioned along the interior walls. The entity's location is inferred, never observed. Beyond the cell itself, a broader protocol governs the entire Foundation's handling of the anomaly. Any photograph, any video recording, any still frame or captured likeness of SCP-096's face is strictly forbidden. Such materials may not be produced, transmitted, or retained without the explicit joint approval of the assigned senior researcher and an O5 council member. Violations are treated as breach events. The reason for these precautions is documented in full within the following sections. The subject itself presents as a humanoid creature, standing approximately 2.38 meters in height. Its frame is unusually gaunt. Preliminary body mass analysis indicates mild malnutrition, though the entity does not appear to require sustenance in any conventional sense, nor has any feeding behavior been observed. Muscle tone is minimal. Despite this apparent frailty, physical strength recorded during agitated states far exceeds anything the subject's musculature should permit. The arms are grossly disproportionate to the rest of the body, each measuring roughly 1.5 meters in length. When at rest, they hang loose against the entity's sides, the fingertips reaching well below the knees. The skin is almost entirely devoid of pigmentation, a pallid waxen white. There is no body hair of any kind. The jaw is capable of opening to approximately 4 times the normal range of an average human. When closed, the face otherwise resembles that of a person, save for the eyes, which are likewise unpigmented and unnervingly pale. Whether the subject possesses functional sight has not been determined. It shows no signs of higher cognition. It does not respond to speech, gesture, or attempts at communication. It is not considered sapient. It is not considered aware in any meaningful sense. And yet, when observed, it reacts. Under normal conditions, SCP-096 is extraordinarily passive. Pressure sensor readings from within the cell consistently show that the subject spends the majority of each day pacing slowly along the eastern wall, back and forth in a repetitive and undeviating pattern. It does not vocalize. It does not strike the walls. It does not react to sound, temperature, or vibration. Field observation prior to containment indicated the same behavior even in extreme environmental conditions, including sub-zero temperatures well below what any unclothed human body could tolerate. The subject displayed no shivering, no change in gait, no apparent discomfort. In every documented state of rest, the entity appears indifferent to its surroundings. This tranquility, however, is entirely conditional. It persists only so long as no living being perceives the entity's face. The moment such perception occurs, whether by direct line of sight, through a photograph, through a still image, or through recorded video footage, the state collapses. The subject enters what researchers describe as a stage of considerable emotional distress. It raises its hands to cover its face. It begins to scream. It begins to cry. It begins to babble incoherently, producing vocalizations that observers have described as unmistakably human in character, though wholly without content.
This behavior lasts approximately 1 to 2 minutes. During this interval, the subject remains largely stationary, hunched, and vocalizing. Once this phase concludes, the entity begins to move. It runs. It runs in the direct line of the individual who perceived its face, thereafter designated SCP-096-1. Recorded pursuit speeds have varied significantly, ranging from roughly 35 kilometers per hour to values considerably higher, and appear to correlate with the distance between the entity and its target. The greater the distance, the greater the velocity. During pursuit, no known material, structural barrier, or physical intervention has been demonstrated to impede the subject's progress. Walls have been passed through. Reinforced obstacles have been torn apart. The physical location of SCP-096-1 does not appear to influence the outcome. Distance, terrain, elevation, and concealment are irrelevant. The subject exhibits what can only be described as an innate awareness of the target's position, moving toward it in a direct and uninterrupted path. It is important to note that this reaction does not occur when the entity's face is depicted through artistic rendering. Drawings, paintings, and other stylized representations do not produce the trigger response. The condition for provocation appears to be direct visual capture of the actual face. Upon reaching SCP-096-1, the subject engages the target with extreme physical violence. In every recorded instance, without exception, no identifiable remains of the target have been recovered. 100% of encounters have resulted in the total disappearance of SCP-096-1. Following the encounter, the entity remains at the site for several minutes. It sits. It does not vocalize during this period. It appears to regain composure gradually, its posture relaxing, its breathing slowing. Once this recovery is complete, the subject stands and begins to move. It attempts to return to what field researchers have described as its natural habitat, the specific location of which remains classified within Foundation records. Its docility fully resumes. Its pacing resumes. It becomes, once again, the quiet, malnourished creature at the eastern wall. Given the nature of the trigger and the ease with which any photograph, any video frame, any casual glance could initiate a pursuit, Foundation analysts have identified a substantial risk of chain reaction events. A single leaked image could theoretically produce cascading incidents across an unbounded civilian population, resulting in mass loss of life and catastrophic breach of Foundation secrecy. For this reason, any retrieval of the subject following an escape event is designated alpha priority. The following is drawn from the recorded interview between the assigned senior researcher and the retired captain who commanded retrieval team Zulu 9A during the initial acquisition of SCP-096. The captain describes initial retrieval duty as an inherently hazardous assignment, undertaken with limited briefing. Field technicians had provided only partial information regarding the target. The order given was to bag and tag. No warning was issued regarding the danger of viewing the entity's face. 2 helicopters were deployed. The captain's team occupied the first. A second team, Zulu 9B, followed with a supervising researcher aboard the backup aircraft. The target was located approximately 2 kilometers north of the assigned patrol path. The captain believed, in retrospect, that the entity had not been facing their direction upon initial sighting. Had it been, he stated, the encounter would have ended immediately. The ambient temperature at the site was recorded well below zero, deep into sub-zero conditions. The captain confirmed that the subject stood unclothed in this environment and displayed no reaction whatsoever to the cold. It did not shiver. It did not adjust its posture. The team landed and approached. A corporal prepared to secure the target with containment materials. At this moment, the supervising researcher made contact by radio, and the captain turned to answer. That single act of turning away, the captain believes, is what preserved his life. In the moment his attention shifted, the target turned. The remainder of the squad, still facing forward, saw its face directly. The reaction was immediate. The entity began to scream and cry, vocalizations described by the captain as unmistakably human in character, unlike any animal sound, and deeply disturbing to those who heard them. The squad opened fire. The response had no effect. The subject seized the corporal and tore the limb from his body. The captain recounted the corporal calling out for assistance in the moments before he was overtaken. Sustained fire continued from the remaining members of the squad. Rounds struck the entity repeatedly. The captain estimated at least 1,000 rounds were discharged in total, including a sustained burst of approximately 20 seconds from a heavy-caliber door gun mounted on the helicopter, delivering hundreds of large-caliber rounds directly into the subject. The captain ordered the deployment of an anti-tank weapon, a system he had begun carrying in the field following an earlier anomalous incident. He reported having previously seen the weapon defeat armored vehicles with ease. Against SCP-096, it produced the same visible effect, removing a large portion of the entity's torso in a wide half-circle. Despite catastrophic tissue loss, the subject did not react to the injury. It did not flinch. It did not slow. According to the captain, the entity must have lost the entirety of its internal organs and circulatory volume, yet acknowledged none of it. The skeletal structure remained intact throughout the engagement, and the subject continued to dismantle the remaining members of the squad without pause. When the second team arrived, the captain's squad was gone. Zulu 9B succeeded in placing a containment bag over the entity's head. The moment its face was covered, the subject ceased all activity and sat down on the ground. It was loaded aboard the second helicopter without further incident and transported to the containment site. The captain stated that he did not know how he had avoided seeing the entity's face throughout the engagement, and offered no explanation beyond chance. When offered an artist's rendering of the subject's face for viewing, the captain declined, stating that having heard the vocalizations of the entity and of his men, he did not wish to attach a face to those sounds. The interview concluded. Following the captain's departure, the senior researcher formally requested that SCP-096 be terminated at the earliest opportunity. Records indicate the termination order was subsequently approved, its execution assigned to the requesting researcher, its date sealed within Foundation archives. What followed is recorded elsewhere, under the designation of a separate incident. For now, the entity remains within its cube. It paces the eastern wall. It does not know it is watched. It must never be seen. There is an object in Foundation custody that does not need to be fast. It waits, sometimes for months, without moving. It prefers the young. It walks through walls, and it leaves behind a black residue that eats through steel, stone, and living tissue alike. It has no docile state. What follows is its file. The subject is designated SCP-106. Its object class is Keter. Foundation classification of Keter is not applied lightly. It is assigned to anomalies which cannot be reliably contained, which have demonstrated the capacity to escape at will, and which pose an ongoing, active threat to human life and to the operational integrity of Foundation sites. SCP-106 has met each of these criteria repeatedly, across multiple containment revisions, at multiple secure locations, over an extended operational history. In appearance, SCP-106 presents as an elderly humanoid figure, hunched, thin, and exhibiting a general condition of advanced decomposition. The specific presentation varies from observation to observation. Features shift, posture shifts. The impression of the figure is not fixed. What remains constant across all recorded encounters is the rotting quality, a persistent aspect of decay that clings to the entity regardless of its immediate form. It is coated in a thick, black, mucus-like substance which drips continuously from its body and pools beneath it wherever it comes to rest. The substance is not incidental. It is the mechanism by which SCP-106 alters its environment and, in the estimation of current research, the mechanism by which it feeds. SCP-106 is not physically imposing in the conventional sense. It is not exceptionally agile. It is not swift. It has been observed to remain motionless for days at a time, positioned in a corner, along a wall, or clinging to a ceiling, waiting. It is capable of scaling any vertical surface without apparent effort, and it can remain suspended upside down for indefinite periods. When it chooses to attack, it does so with methodical intent. It does not attempt to kill outright. Instead, it targets major organs, muscle groups, and tendons, seeking to incapacitate. Once its prey is disabled and unable to flee, SCP-106 draws the subject into what has been provisionally termed its pocket dimension. Analysis of documented incidents indicates a clear preference in prey selection. SCP-106 appears to favor human subjects within the age bracket of approximately 10 to 25 years. This preference is consistent and has been observed across every documented predation event in the Foundation record. The most immediately dangerous property of SCP-106 is the corrosion effect it induces in all solid matter with which it makes contact. Several seconds after touch, the affected material begins to undergo physical breakdown. Metals rust and pit. Wood rots. Concrete cracks and crumbles. Living tissue is affected most severely of all. The affected area produces a black, mucus-like substance identical to that which coats SCP-106 itself. This corrosion is assumed by Foundation research to be a pre-digestive action, the entity beginning the process of consuming its environment or its prey before physical contact is even fully complete. The corrosion effect does not stop immediately. It continues in the affected material for approximately 6 hours after the initial contact, during which time the material continues to degrade. After this period, the effect appears to burn out on its own, leaving behind only the ruined substrate and traces of the black residue. Any corrosion observed on containment cell surfaces, on staff members, or at any site location within a 200-meter radius of SCP-106 is to be reported to site security immediately. Any objects or personnel lost to SCP-106 are classified as missing or killed in action. No recovery attempts are to be made under any circumstances. SCP-106 is capable of passing directly through solid matter. It does not require openings. It does not require doors. When it moves through a wall, a floor, or a ceiling, It leaves behind a large patch of its corrosive mucus, marking the point of entry. Within the substrate, the entity vanishes entirely, entering what is assumed to be a form of pocket dimension. It is then able to exit this dimension from any point connected to the original entry surface. It may enter the inner face of a wall and emerge from the outer face. It may enter a wall and emerge from a ceiling, or from a floor several rooms away. The topology of ordinary architecture appears to be, for SCP-106, a set of connected surfaces which it may pass into and out of at will. It is not currently known whether this dimension is the point of origin for the entity, or whether it is a layer constructed by SCP-106 for its own use. Limited observation of the interior of this dimension has shown it to be comprised largely of halls and rooms, with further details of its structure and access redacted from open documentation. Activity within the dimension has been observed to continue for days at a time. Some subjects taken by SCP-106 have been released back into the standard environment, apparently for the purpose of being hunted again, recaptured, and subjected to further activity that has been formally expunged from the record. The initial containment procedures for SCP-106 were drafted with the assumption that the entity could be isolated through physical separation and standoff distance. No physical interaction with SCP-106 was permitted at any time, and any exception required a 2/3 vote from O5 Command, restricted to testing situations. All personnel, whether research, security, or Class D, were required to remain at least 20 meters from the containment cell at all times, except for mandated maintenance and re-evaluation checks. The primary containment cell was itself held suspended within a secondary cell, the walls of which were required to stand at least 30 meters distant from the outer walls of the primary. The secondary cell was to remain under total observation, kept fully illuminated, and cleared of any and all debris. Any objects, any movement, or any activity within the secondary cell that fell outside normal parameters was to trigger an immediate full-site lockdown. Lockdown would be maintained until a situation normal dispatch was issued by Site Command. It was noted at the outset that SCP-106 does not possess a docile state. Any apparent reduction in activity, any apparent increased compliance, was to be interpreted immediately as a luring tactic preceding an aggressive action and treated accordingly. These original procedures were subsequently discontinued due to escape percentage. The second revision of containment procedures attempted a more materially aggressive approach. Physical interaction remained forbidden without O5 approval. Standoff distance was extended, and personnel were required to remain at least 30 meters from the cell at all times, except under direct order from Site Command. SCP-106 was to be held within a sealed container comprised of 16 layers of lead-lined steel, each layer separated from the next by open space, aside from minimal support struts. The container was then suspended by a continuous current system within a fluid medium, and this fluid medium was to be replaced in 48-hour cycles and monitored continuously for any intrusion of corrosion. Observation had begun to yield useful insights. SCP-106 displayed a slight resistance when passing through lead or other similar metals, though the thickness of the material appeared to make no meaningful difference. Multiple layers of thin material, however, appeared to slow the entity, forcing it to enter and re-emerge repeatedly rather than passing through in a single traversal. Fluids also appeared to temporarily confuse the entity. These findings shaped the design of the fluid suspension system. This revision was likewise discontinued. Multiple surface breaches occurred, and the agitation system, intended to protect the container, instead dispersed the corrosive residue throughout the medium during the breach event. The dispersal produced further breaches, one after another, until containment failed entirely. Revision 11-8 represents the current standard of containment for SCP-106, drafted after the failures of the previous two protocols
and after the analysis of every recorded breach and recovery to date. No physical interaction with SCP-106 is permitted at any time. All physical interaction must be approved by no less than a 2/3 vote from O5 Command, and any such interaction must be conducted within AR-2 maximum security sites following a general evacuation of non-essential staff. All personnel are to remain at least 60 meters from the containment cell at all times, except in the event of a breach. SCP-106 is to be held within a sealed container of lead-lined steel. That container is then sealed within 40 additional layers of identical material, with generous empty space between each layer, and with the support struts between layers randomly spaced rather than aligned. The container itself is to remain suspended, held clear of any surface by electromagnetic supports. The secondary containment area consists of 16 spherical cells, each filled with various fluids, and each arranged with a random assembly of internal surfaces and supports. The secondary containment is fitted with a light system capable of flooding the entire assembly with intense illumination instantly, without any direct human involvement being required to initiate it. Both containment areas remain under continuous surveillance. The design choices in the current revision are the direct product of accumulated observation. Continued research has established that when SCP-106 is confronted with highly complex and randomized assemblies of structures, it can be functionally confused, exhibiting a marked delay in both entering and exiting the assembly. This delay is significant enough to be exploited in containment. SCP-106 has also demonstrated an aversion to direct, sudden light. This aversion does not manifest as any observable physical damage to the entity. Instead, SCP-106 responds by rapidly exiting the illuminated space into the pocket dimension it generates on any nearby solid surface. Taken together, the observations of lead aversion, liquid confusion, structural complexity confusion, and light aversion have been employed in the design of the current containment array. According to internal figures, the combined application of these principles has reduced the general escape incidence associated with SCP-106 by approximately 43%. The primary cell design has also proven effective in recovery incidents requiring the standing recall protocol, the identifier of which remains redacted in open documentation. Observation of the entity, its behaviors, and its response to containment measures is ongoing. The reduction figure is not 0. It has never been 0. Behavioral notes accompany the containment file. SCP-106 has been observed to enter long periods of dormancy, during which it remains completely motionless for up to 3 months. The cause of these dormant periods is not known. What is known is that they should not be interpreted as safe. Analysis of past incidents indicates that dormancy operates as a lulling tactic. When SCP-106 emerges from a dormant state, it does so in a highly agitated condition. It attacks and abducts personnel, and it inflicts substantial damage on its containment cell and on the surrounding site infrastructure. Any prolonged inactivity is treated internally as a countdown rather than a reprieve. SCP-106 also appears to hunt and attack based on desire rather than on hunger. During a hunting behavior event, it will attack and collect multiple prey subjects, keeping many of them alive within the pocket dimension for extended periods. There is no determinable limit to the number it will take. The count during any given event appears to be arbitrary. The inner dimension accessed by SCP-106 appears to be accessible only to SCP-106 itself. Recording and transmission devices carried by taken subjects have been shown to continue functioning within the dimension, although the resulting recordings and transmissions are severely degraded. From what has been recovered, it appears that SCP-106 plays with captured prey, and that within its dimension, it exercises full control over time, space, and perception. Further characterization of this behavior has been expunged. Due to the exceedingly difficult nature of the entity, the containment file for SCP-106 is reviewed every 3 months, and additionally, following any breach incident. Physical restraints are impossible. Direct physical damage has demonstrated no effect on the entity. The current file, as of the most recent revision, is built around basic observation and immediate response. Every earlier, more proactive protocol has been recalled due to breach events, the identifiers of which are redacted from open circulation. In the event of a breach, the standing recall protocol is initiated. A human subject within the 10 to 25-year age bracket, matching the entity's established prey preference, is prepared while the compromised containment cell is replaced and restored for use. When the cell is ready, the subject is injured, preferably through the breakage of a long bone, such as the femur, or through the severing of a major tendon, such as the Achilles. The subject is then placed within the prepared cell, and the sound produced by the subject is transmitted across the site public address system. SCP-106 typically begins to gravitate toward the lure within 10 to 15 minutes of the broadcast beginning. Should the entity not respond, additional physical trauma is administered to the lure at 20-minute intervals until it does. In the event of a major breach, multiple lures may be used simultaneously. Following completion of its interaction with a lure, SCP-106 typically enters a dormant state. Further outcomes for lure subjects have been expunged from open record. There is no docile state. There is only the interval before the next event. Observation continues. They came at the walls, calm as anything, requesting that the occupants leave the store. Subject 3008 is an IKEA that does not end, and its staff do not bleed. What survivors called the exchange, and why its walls now bear deliberate holes, is documented later in this file. During the previous night, individuals presenting as retail staff converged upon the settlement designated the exchange, requesting in measured and courteous tones that the occupants vacate the premises, while simultaneously attempting to breach the surrounding walls with their unaided hands. Field accounts indicate that a substantial number of such entities participated in the incursion, and that assaults of this kind are understood by long-term inhabitants to occur with predictable regularity. The population had prepared accordingly. Improvised armaments were drawn from materials available within the surrounding structure, including implements requisitioned from the restaurant facilities, blades removed from groundskeeping equipment and refitted into handheld cutting tools, and a single axe intended for emergency use. At least one inhabitant is reported to have constructed a functional projectile weapon from scavenged components. The defensive walls of the exchange were observed to contain pre-existing apertures, unnoticed by the reporting party until the moment of engagement. These openings appear to have been fashioned deliberately to permit the occupants to strike outward at attacking entities while remaining behind cover. The reporting party confirms personal participation in the neutralization of multiple assailants through these apertures. The staff analogs do not appear to bleed when injured. Despite this deviation from ordinary human physiology, they are subdued with comparable ease once sufficiently punctured, exhibiting no notable resistance to conventional injury beyond the absence of visible hemorrhage. In the hours following the attack, the surviving occupants were required to remove the neutralized entities from the immediate vicinity of the exchange. Long-standing observation indicates that remains left in proximity to a settlement during the overnight interval will draw further staff analogs toward the location. To mitigate this outcome, the bodies were loaded onto wheeled conveyances of the type ordinarily used within the structure for the transport of large merchandise. The remains were then relocated to a separate area of the environment identified by the inhabitants as pickup. It is noted that locations within the anomaly
are commonly designated by whichever overhead signage happens to be visible above them. Recovered materials associated with the subject include an IKEA-branded journal, apparently maintained during the subject's presence within SCP-30081. Contents are reproduced here without alteration for the purpose of clinical review. The author of the journal opens with an admission of disorientation, framing the account as a possible descent into personal instability. At the time of writing, the author reports having been trapped within the retail environment for approximately 2 days without encountering another individual. An initial hypothesis of an elaborate prank is described, in which the premises had ostensibly been emptied and rearranged as a maze. This hypothesis is discarded once attempts at retracing prior movement fail. The subject notes that the arrangement of the interior appears to have shifted, producing successive rows of bookcases in place of any exit. The journal records the failure of interior illumination at approximately 2200 hours, preceded by an audible electrical report. The author locates a display bed and sleeps, making use of an integrated light on a personal mobile device. No signal is available on said device. The following day is spent in continued attempts to locate an exit, all unsuccessful. The author reports the discovery of an operating restaurant serving prepared meatballs, described as warm and freshly prepared, despite the absence of visible staff. A return to the bedding display area is made prior to the next scheduled loss of illumination. A subsequent entry, timed shortly after 9 in the morning, notes the restoration of light and the author's intention to proceed in a chosen direction, the immediate vicinity of the entry point having been thoroughly searched. By the third day, the author records a sustained walk of roughly 3 hours in an approximately linear path, terminating at a ladder positioned beside one of the tall stock shelving units characteristic of the environment. The author ascends to obtain a broader view. The resulting observation is that the interior extends without apparent termination, a continuous field of shelves, tables, and assorted furnishings receding to the horizon. A single distant figure is observed in motion, toward which the author proceeds. The figure, upon approach, is identified by the author as bearing the store's staff uniform and is initially assumed to be an employee. The author notes that the entity's suitability for such a role cannot be discounted, given the environment. The specimen is described as approximately 7 feet in height, with elongated upper limbs, foreshortened lower limbs, and a complete absence of facial features. No eyes, no ears, no mouth are observed. The entity fails to acknowledge the author's presence, and, given the absence of standard sensory organs, it cannot be established whether such presence was registered at all. The author considers physical contact as a means of eliciting response, but declines to proceed on the basis of the entity's hand proportions, which are estimated as sufficient to inflict severe crushing injury. The entity continues along its path and passes from view. The author resumes travel in the previous direction. Accommodations for that evening are documented as unsatisfactory. The author reports entry into a section containing hard, sharply angled tables and improvises bedding from folded tablecloths. The author's mobile telephone is noted to have exhausted its battery during the day. The device had been non-functional throughout, yet its cessation is described by the author as the loss of a critical connection. Subsequent entries describe a prolonged visual monotony. For a period given as 2 days, the author observes only successive rows of a single identical bookshelf model. Forward progress is confirmed by overhead signage moving past overhead, though no signage indicating an exit is encountered. The author remarks on the disorientation, comparing it to animated sequences
in which repeated doorways yield identical corridors. The author acknowledges the absence of any addressee for these observations and reframes the record as preparatory material for an intended memoir concerning an ordinary visit to an ordinary retail location. Records then indicate first contact with additional human occupants. The author reports having ceased to be the sole trapped individual. On the sixth night, two staff entities, distinct in form from the first, approached in darkness. The entities were heard to announce, in polite terms, that the store was closed and that the author was required to leave, while advancing in a manner consistent with predatory attack. The author reports subsequent flight through the interior of the affected retail environment, describing a period of sustained running past further installations of large industrial shelving. Upon clearing one such structure, the author observed an illuminated settlement of considerable scale. The settlement appears to have been assembled by prior occupants from available store inventory, incorporating shelving units, bed frames, tables, and comparable furnishings into a defensive perimeter. Illumination was provided by portable torches and floodlights, presumably scavenged from within the location. The author describes the site in strongly positive emotional terms. The occupants of the settlement appear to have detected the author's approach, whether by visual or auditory means. A gate in the perimeter wall was opened, and two individuals were observed signaling the author to enter. Following the author's admission, the gate was closed. Immediately thereafter, impacts consistent with the pursuing entities striking the exterior of the gate were noted. The entities continued to broadcast their standard verbal announcement regarding the closure of the store for a period, after which they dispersed from the immediate area. The settlement is designated by its inhabitants as Exchange. The name is derived from signage suspended from the ceiling directly above the site, reading Exchange and Returns. The community is reported to contain in excess of 50 individuals, all described by the author as anatomically typical, in contrast to the pursuing entities documented previously. Provisions, sleeping arrangements, and functioning electrical illumination drawn from the location's internal power supply are available. At the time of the author's account, 7 days had elapsed since initial entry into the anomaly. The author reports that prolonged isolation prior to reaching Exchange had produced significant doubt regarding personal sanity, and that contact with other surviving occupants has substantially alleviated this concern. The author further indicates that Exchange is not a unique settlement. Additional communities of varying population are reported to exist elsewhere within the anomaly. The author expresses uncertainty as to how a population of this magnitude could be absent from the external world without corresponding public awareness, and considers the possibility that only a subset of visitors to affected locations are subject to displacement. Displaced individuals within SCP-3008 refer to the humanoid entities encountered inside the anomaly simply as the staff. Interview subjects consistently report that during periods of illumination, these entities appear passive, occupying the aisles and behaving in a manner superficially consistent with retail employees. Upon cessation of the interior lighting, however, the entities are described as becoming acutely hostile toward the human population. Consequently, daylight hours are used by inhabitants to locate provisions, potable water, and other necessary materials. Testimony indicates that restaurants, cafeterias, and secondary retail spaces are present throughout the interior and are subject to periodic replenishment by an unidentified process. The mechanism of this restocking has not been established. Some inhabitants speculate that the staff themselves are responsible, though the intervals between resupply events are described as irregular and sometimes prolonged, necessitating the rationing of available food.
One recovered account observes, with evident resentment, that the entities might complete such tasks more efficiently were they not otherwise occupied in the pursuit of human occupants after dark. At the onset of interior night, inhabitants withdraw into fortified positions constructed within the walls of the structure. This pattern is reported to be uniform throughout the accessible interior. Displaced individuals have proposed multiple hypotheses regarding the nature of the location, including the suggestion that it constitutes a primary or archetypal instance from which conventional retail outlets are in some manner derived, as well as the alternative proposal that the environment is a subjective phenomenon produced by prolonged sensory monotony. The recovered testimony indicates that its author had, at the time of writing, remained within SCP-3008 for approximately 10 days. The majority of other inhabitants questioned reported that they had ceased tracking elapsed time. One individual is said to have claimed a residence of several years. A portion of the document following this passage is illegible. The account further notes the existence of rumors concerning successful egress, as well as reports of exits observed and subsequently vanishing prior to use. The author expresses personal credence in these accounts, citing the broader implausibility of the environment as justification. The subject describes a scavenging expedition undertaken in the company of 2 other survivors, whose presence within the anomaly is noted without elaboration. Familiarity with the internal landmarks of the environment is characterized as sufficient for basic navigation. Overhead signage is cited as a principal aid, supplemented by more distinctive features visible from a distance. Among these, the author notes a substantial collapse of the oversized stock shelving, portions of which have fallen against one another and remain in that configuration. Further away, in a direction the survivors have designated as east, while acknowledging the absence of any means to verify orientation, a structure of apparent wooden construction is observed to extend upward to the ceiling of the environment. The author speculates that its builders may have intended to breach the roof. The structure reportedly illuminates during the nocturnal period, suggesting occupation, though the distance is estimated at several days of travel on foot, and no direct contact with its inhabitants is documented. The author further remarks upon their own survival during the initial week within the anomaly, spent without shelter and without hostile encounter with the resident staff entities. This outcome is characterized as anomalously fortunate. During the expedition, foodstuffs were recovered from a shop interior. The author notes that the shelves appeared to have been restocked overnight and attributes this to the activity of the staff without further comment. A wall-mounted telephone was tested. A voice responded on the line, but its output consisted of unrelated words assembled without discernible syntactic or semantic coherence. The author compares the pattern to recorded speech associated with aphasia. The voice did not respond to direct address. According to one of the accompanying survivors, all telephones within the environment exhibit this behavior. The author subsequently reflects on the internal atmosphere of the anomaly. Given the reported height and apparent unbounded extent of the ceiling, they express expectation of some form of internal weather phenomena, referencing prior familiarity with large enclosed structures known to generate their own atmospheric conditions. The author states that no variation in temperature, nor any other meteorological event, has been perceived during their occupancy. Following the aggressive incursion described in the previous section, the author documents the disposal of the incapacitated staff units. The description is presented in restrained terms. The volume of expired figures is estimated at several hundred, possibly greater, arranged in accumulated piles for removal. Notably, no odor is reported. The author observes that these entities, in addition to producing no blood when injured, do not appear to undergo decomposition after cessation of movement. Opportunistic examination of one of the more severely damaged specimens is described. According to the account, the internal composition of the entity is uniform throughout.
No skeletal structure, no musculature, and no visceral organs were identified. The material is characterized only as skin, or a substance resembling skin, extending through the full cross-section. The author expresses uncertainty as to whether the entities can accurately be classified as living. This uncertainty is compounded by earlier observations suggesting the presence of rigid internal support during locomotion, and by the tactile resistance reportedly felt during the previous night's altercation. The author speculates, without conclusion, that some form of post-mortem transformation may occur. The matter is set aside as one of numerous unresolved anomalies associated with the location. The author then turns to a sociological observation. In popular fictional treatments of comparable scenarios, isolated communities are typically depicted as descending into internal conflict over resources or authority. Within the interior, this pattern is reportedly absent. Individuals from other settlements are said to visit intermittently, either to exchange information or to trade goods during shortages. All such interactions are characterized as cordial. The author offers several tentative explanations, including the shared external threat posed by the staff units and the continuous replenishment of merchandise within the structure, which may reduce competition. A final possibility is proposed, that human conduct under such conditions is simply more cooperative than commonly assumed. The author elects to accept this interpretation. A further group is subsequently received at the settlement, reportedly the sole survivors of another community overrun during the night. They are admitted without incident. Combined recollection indicates the existence of numerous additional settlements within the anomaly, the full extent of which remains unknown. The journal describes a growing awareness among the interned that no external search appears to be underway. The author estimates a residence of slightly over 2 months at the time of writing, and reports that new arrivals continue to appear at irregular intervals, each recounting the same circumstance of an ordinary visit terminating in indefinite confinement.
Hostile incursions by staff instances are described as a recurring feature of settlement life, occurring 1 or more times per week and resulting in periodic casualties among the residents. The author notes with clinical resignation that human occupants remain biologically vulnerable within the anomaly, while the staff appear not to bleed. A subsequent entry records the passage of an unmanned aerial vehicle bearing a camera above the settlement. The author initially interprets this as evidence of an external rescue effort. It is noted that similar sightings have occurred previously without resulting in intervention. The device did not alter course and passed from view. Foundation annotation indicates that this entry corresponds approximately to the first successful deployment of a reconnaissance drone within the anomaly. Recovered footage confirms a walled settlement situated beneath signage reading "Exchange and Returns." Subsequent attempts to relocate the settlement have failed. The provenance of earlier drone sightings remains undetermined. A later entry documents an informal survey conducted among the residents regarding personal histories and general knowledge. The author reports that several individuals exhibited apparent gaps in common cultural and geopolitical information, including unfamiliarity with widely known landmarks, institutions, and public figures. On the basis of these discrepancies, the author advances an unverified hypothesis that the interned population may originate from divergent realities of superficially similar composition. If correct, the hypothesis would account for the absence of any coordinated missing persons response, as each individual would register as an isolated disappearance within their respective world of origin. The Foundation offers no assessment of this conjecture within the recovered document. The author concludes the entry with an acknowledgement of the speculative nature of the reasoning and returns to routine description of settlement conditions. The recovered document, having exhausted its speculative aside, resumes the character of a plain field report. Its later passages return to the practical concerns of habitation within the anomaly.
Structures are described in general terms. Materials are cataloged only as those available within the interior itself, drawn from the shelving and display arrangements of the original retail environment. No reference is made to any construction technique or resource that could not, in principle, be sourced from within the space. Settlement layouts are noted to favor defensible positions. Perimeters are described as reinforced. The document indicates that these fortifications exist specifically to address the presence of the hostile entities designated collectively as SCP-3008-2, though the recovered pages provide no direct description of the entities themselves in this section. The reader is left to infer their significance from the defensive posture of the inhabitants and from the sustained investment of labor implied by the construction of walls and barriers. Foundation analysts, upon reviewing the document, have summarized the following operational conclusions. First, the interior of SCP-3008-1 supports a civilian population of unknown size, self-organized to a degree sufficient to produce durable communal structures. Second, this population regards SCP-3008-2 as a persistent threat, requiring continual vigilance. Third, the retail character of the environment persists throughout the areas described, with fixtures, furniture, and display arrangements remaining broadly consistent with the format of the original store. The document terminates without conclusion. There is no summary, no signature, no indication that the author considered the record complete. Whether the author remains within SCP-3008-1 or has since exited through means unobserved by Foundation personnel monitoring the entrance is not established. The pages were recovered from a subject encountered during routine debriefing, and the circumstances of their composition, transport, and release have not been reconstructed to the satisfaction of the reviewing staff. Current containment protocols remain unchanged. The entrance is monitored. Egress is processed as previously described. The interior remains, for the present, uncharted beyond the limits already noted, and further testing is subject to authorization by the senior researcher. Attention now turns to the entities designated SCP-3008-2, which populate the interior space. These humanoid figures superficially resemble ordinary human beings, though their proportions are described as exaggerated and inconsistent, with individual instances appearing either markedly too short or markedly too tall. Their heads bear no facial features of any kind. In every observed case, instances are attired in a yellow shirt and blue trousers consistent with the uniform worn by employees of the original retail chain. The interior maintains a rudimentary day and night cycle, regulated by the activation and deactivation of the overhead lighting. These transitions occur at intervals consistent with the opening and closing hours of the original store. During the night phase, instances of SCP-3008-2 become violent toward all other life forms present within the space. While engaged in such behavior, they have been recorded vocalizing phrases in English, most frequently variations of the statement that the store is now closed and that patrons are to exit the building. Once the day phase resumes, the instances immediately revert to a passive state and begin moving through the interior in a manner that appears to lack discernible purpose. In this passive state, they do not respond to questioning or other verbal address, though they will react with violence if provoked. One or more exits are known to exist within the interior, though these do not occupy fixed positions, which substantially complicates any attempt to depart the space once entry has been made. Personnel are reminded that any door other than the main entrance, as well as any breach made through the walls of the retail unit itself, leads only into the ordinary, non-anomalous interior of the original store. Since the initiation of containment, 14 individuals have successfully exited the anomaly. Following extensive debriefing, each has been administered amnestics and released. Incident 3008-1 is recorded as follows. At approximately midnight on a date presently redacted, an adult male exited the anomaly, followed shortly thereafter by an instance of SCP-3008-2. The instance overtook the man before being terminated by armed response personnel. This remains the only occasion on which an instance has been observed exiting the anomaly. A full autopsy was subsequently conducted. End of session. The files return to the archive. New files are declassified weekly. Secure, contain, protect.